I am going to answer every question you have about Sourdough Starter. My name is Lydia and this is Genevieve, so let's get to it. This video does not cover how to actually create a sourdough starter, but I do have a full video on that. So if you'd like to learn how to make a sourdough starter from scratch, I will leave a link to that video in the description. I would suggest, however, learning all the knowledge that I'm about to share with you before actually going and creating your own starter. Feeding your starter. Let's begin with the basics, feeding your starter. The starter is a living culture. The yeast and bacteria in your starter need to be fed. We feed our starters unbleached flour and room temperature water. The more starter you have, the more it needs to eat. So how much should you feed it? There are so many different approaches to how much you should feed and the different ratios. So let's just take it one step at a time. A basic feeding ratio would be 1-1-1 ratio. Each number stands for the amount of starter, the amount of flour, and the amount of water. This means that however much starter you have, you need to feed it equal amounts of flour and water. For example, if you have 100 grams of starter, you would feed her 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. The food, flour and water, that you fed to your starter is now a part of your active culture, meaning that in the previous example, you would now have 300 grams of sourdough starter. As I said before, this is a basic feeding. You may hear people refer to the ratio they use as 1-2-2, all the way up to 1-5-5 or beyond. Again, the ratio represents how much starter you have to the amount you are feeding your starter. You can adjust how much starter you keep depending on your baking plans. For example, if you are not baking that day, you can feed your starter less, and then the next day you can keep a larger portion of the starter to feed for the baking day. This means that if the next day is not a baking day, that you will have a smaller amount of discard compared to if you fed it a larger portion on the first non-baking day. The cycle of the sourdough starter. Let's chat about the cycle that your starter goes through. After you feed your starter, the organisms in your culture are going to start feeding on the new food that you gave it. That means they will start releasing CO2 gases. This is when your starter will slowly begin to rise. There should be bubbles on the side and top of your starter. As your starter rises, there will be a slight dome shape to it. That indicates to you that your starter is still eating the food that you gave it. It is still active and rising. When the dome flattens, it is called the peak point. This is its most active state, but it is going to start going back down in the jar because it has run out of food. It is no longer creating the gases, and the gases that it had made are slowly being released out into the air, which is why the starter is falling back down. If you have a slower cycle, some reasons for that may be your starter is newer, you may live in a colder environment, or you're giving it a larger feeding ratio because then there's more food to eat for the starter. If your cycle is fast, it may be because it's an older, more established starter, your environment is warmer, or you're giving it a smaller feeding ratio. It will peak more quickly because then it doesn't have as much food to eat. If you let your starter fall, it will start smelling like paint thinner. This scent is the starter telling you that she is hungry. When to feed your starter. So when should you feed your starter? You can either feed your starter when it peaks or after when it is in the hungry state. There are many different approaches to when you should feed your starter, but you really just need to figure out what works best for you. Some people feed twice a day. Others go up to a week before feeding. I feed my starter every night, whether Genevieve has fallen or not. It will not hurt your starter to be in a hungry state for a little while. This also makes feeding your starter much more comprehensible and not as intimidating. In the beginning, however, with a weaker starter, I would recommend feeding your starter directly after it peaks. The longer you have your starter, the stronger she gets, the more established your starter becomes. You can start to play around with different timings and really just find out what works best for you and your schedule. If you live somewhere hot, you may want to add a feeding or increase your feeding ratio so that your starter doesn't peak super duper quickly. If you lived somewhere cold, the yeast activity is slowed down, so you may want to feed it less so that it doesn't have as much food to get through before it actually peaks. When is the starter ready to go in the dough? So you've got the starter down and are ready to make a loaf. So when can you make dough with her? Thankfully, there is a wide window in which you can use the starter after it has been fed. When your starter has doubled in size, it is most likely active enough and strong enough to leaven a loaf of bread. If you want to be sure before adding it to your dough, you can perform what we call the float test. The float test is when you take a little bit of your starter and drop it in a glass of water. If the starter floats, then you know the starter is vigorous enough to leaven a loaf of bread. However, if it sinks to the bottom, it is not ready to leaven a loaf yet. You need to give it a little bit more time. The earlier you use the starter, the less strong the sourdough flavor will be in your bread. The longer you wait before it falls completely, of course, the more intense the flavor will be because it had more time to ferment. If you use your starter when it hits the peak point or even right before or right after, that is where you will get the most rise out of your loaf. If you use the starter after it has been falling for a while, but not completely fallen, you will get a very good sourdough flavor, but the rise will not be as tall because it has run out of food and entered a dormant stage. I would suggest using your starter when the dome flattens, meaning its peak point, or right before or right after. Creating a leaven. What is a leaven? This can be really confusing to people, so let's quickly go through it and explain what those recipes are talking about when they say create a leaven. Leaven means the portion of your starter that will be going into your bread dough. Creating your leaven refers to taking a little portion of your starter and putting it into a different jar and feeding it in that other jar. That entire portion would then turn into your leaven. And then you would add the whole jar into your bread dough. You could do this if you wanted to change the food for your leaven from what you normally feed your starter, or if you wanted a different hydration level for the leaven, or if your timeline is just too complicated with the starter and you needed a different time frame for this new loaf. These are some of the reasons that people use a leaven. However, I do not do this. While it can be helpful in some situations, I find it more confusing and time-consuming than simply taking the leaven out from my risen starter to go directly into the dough. I know this can seem confusing when you see it in a recipe, so I just wanted to go over it quickly. And if you have any further questions about it, just drop them in the comments and I will answer you. Feeding times. Generally, feeding at the same time every day is optimal. It is okay to feed your starter a little bit early or a little bit late, depending on when you need your leaven by. While it may not be the most optimal, completely best situation, starters are strong and can take a lot. Your starter will be okay if it is not fed at the exact same time every day. You can also adjust your feeding ratios to accommodate your timeline. For example, if you need the dough to be ready quickly, you can do a 1-1-1 feeding. If you want to bake with it the next day, you could do a 1-3-3 feeding. If you are a professional baker or selling your bread, you probably need to be a little bit more rigid here. But for the everyday home baker, this is a non-intimidating way to start to understand sourdough starter. I feed my starter once a day, every night. So after I use the starter in the morning generally, I will wait until the nighttime to feed her again. And then she is always at peak in the morning, which is when I will use her and start baking again. You can feed right away after using if you want to make another dough very quickly. What food should we feed the starter? Any flour made from wheat, as long as it is unbleached, is okay. You can use unbleached all-purpose flour, which is what I do because it's the cheapest and easiest. You can use bread flour, whole wheat flour, or rye flour. When you are creating your starter, it is a great idea to use whole wheat or rye flour. The whole grains in these flours help the culture to develop and the fermentation to happen faster. When your starter is more established, you can choose to switch it to a different flour if you desire. Depending on what flavor you are looking for from your bread, you can determine what flour you want to switch it to. A starter that is fed with whole wheat or rye flour is going to have more of a sour taste. The grains ferment and peak more quickly than all white flour. If you use all-purpose or bread flour, it will give you a more mild flavored bread. You can also create a combination of these flavors to nail down the exact flavor that you are looking for. If you'd like to change the kind of flour you're giving your starter, it will just need a couple of feedings to completely adjust it to the new food. Do it with a 75% old flour and 25% new flour and slowly increase the new flour percentage. A lot of people also feed their starter a combination of all-purpose and bread flour because the bread flour has more protein for the starter to eat, which will in turn make it stronger. Keeping your starter in the fridge. If you bake once a week or less, I would keep your starter in the fridge just so you do not have to feed her every day. We're trying to make sourdough starter not intimidating, and a good way to do that is to start baking once a week and ease your way into it. If you keep her in the fridge, feed her once every 10 days to keep it healthy and thriving. When you're going to feed your starter from the fridge, take it out and let it be for a couple hours or at least an hour so that it can come to room temperature. Then do your normal feeding. After feeding it, let it have about an hour to just become active and then put it back in the fridge. Now it has plenty of food left to eat in the fridge. The coolness of the fridge slows down the eating, but doesn't stop the eating. If you wanted to bake with it instead of putting it back in the fridge, just wait till it domes and then use it. Or if you want it to be a little bit more active, you can do 2 feedings before using it in your dough. Discard. Sourdough discard is the portion of your sourdough starter that you remove before feeding it with fresh flour and water. Since a sourdough starter is a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria, regular feedings are needed to keep it active and prevent it from growing too big. For example, if you were doing a 1-1-1 ratio and you wanted 100 grams of starter and wanted to add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, you would discard however much starter you needed to in order to have 100 grams of starter before feeding it your 1-1-1 ratio. Even though it's called discard, it is not waste. You can use it in recipes like pancakes, waffles, crackers, muffins, and even pizza dough to reduce your food waste. Hopefully you can see now though that you shouldn't really have a large amount of discard because you can adjust your feeding ratios based on how much you need. The most important thing about a sourdough starter is, of course, giving it a name. That is the biggest step that you cannot skip. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to watch this video to learn how to create your very own sourdough starter.